Velkommen til Regelstaten. Mit navn er Jonas Herby, og Regelstaten det er podcast, hvor du, sammen med mig og mine gæster, bliver klogere på, hvad regulering betyder for det danske samfund og den enkelte dansker. I 2016 kom Joachim B. Olsen i politisk modvind, fordi han sagde, at det i hans øjne var, og nu citerer jeg, fordummende, hvis vi ikke accepterer, at der er en biologisk forskel på mænd og kvinder, og at denne forskel giver sig udtryk i, at vi gennemsnitligt tager forskellige valg. Men er der biologiske forskelle på mænd og kvinder, eller skyldes de forskelle, vi ser, at drenge og piger for eksempel opdrages forskelligt? Det er emnet for dagens afsnit, hvor Regelstaten har besøg af professor i økonomi Klaus Desmet, der netop har udgivet studiet The Gender Gap in Preferences Evidence from 45,000 that was totally wrong, 45,397 Facebook interests. Welcome, Klaus.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Klaus, can you start by introducing yourself and maybe tell us a little about why an economist is studying gender gap in preferences?
Okay, very good. So my name is Klaus Desmet. I'm a professor of economics at SMU in the US. And, I became interested in the issue of gender differences and preferences. Because at the end of the day, economics is very much about preferences, right? We want to understand how people take decisions. We want to understand whether those decisions are the best decisions for the individuals that take them. We want to understand how societies function. We want to understand how different groups within society function. And so thinking about how men and women may have different preferences, how that may affect their individual decisions, but also how that may actually translate collectively into societies, for example, that function differently, depending, for instance, whether the parliament has many female members, or whether the parliament is completely male dominated, right? So let's say if there were no differences in preferences between men and women, you could argue it doesn't really matter, right? If the parliament is 50-50 or the parliament is 90-10, we would reach the same decisions as a society if there's no differences in these preferences. Now, to the extent that those preferences are different, it's interesting to know because, say, to go back to the example of politics, if you want to have a body such as the parliament that takes decisions that are collectively good for us as a society, you would want to have these different groups, in this case, for example, men and women, both represented in their fair number, right? And so that's why I agree to some extent. You think about gender and differences. This is very often the realm of psychology, social psychology, maybe sociology, and not so much something that economists used to be interested in. Mm-hmm. But I think we've come to the conclusion that those differences and preferences are very important, both in political and economic decisions, and that's why we as economists, as a group, became interested in studying gender differences.
Yeah, I think the subject is interesting, also because when I was studying the 5 year, I was studying economics. Preferences was just there. I mean, we never discussed where the preferences came from, but so basically we thought that everybody was born with it, but it's probably not like that, because a baby is not that evolved. So I think your study is interesting because you try to answer where do the preferences come from? Is it from our genes or from the society, basically?
Yeah, so there's a question, I think, of both sort of asking where the preferences come from, but also, as you said initially, sort of the fact that preferences are not exogenously given and equal for everyone. right? So the standard simple economic model would just say that every human has the same objectives in life and we're all trying to do the same thing. And that's actually not quite the case, right? When you go a little bit deeper into this, you of course notice many differences across individuals and across different groups. And of course, nothing, that insight is obviously not new for anybody who would be studying psychology, but what are the implications of that insight to our economic thinking? That's kind of where we come in as economists.
So what is the big question you're trying to ask and answer here?
So the big question we are trying to ask and then answer is whether gender differences in preferences, whether those get attenuated or whether they get magnified in more gender equal societies. So let me give you an example. Suppose we compare a Scandinavian country, right, where gender equality is high in terms of opportunities and access to resources. And suppose you compare a Scandinavian country to some developing country where gender equality is much lower. Then the question is, are men and women in Scandinavia more similar to each other in terms of preferences for a wide variety of things? Preferences for sports, for cooking, for poetry, for politics, for computer games, etc., compared to men and women in some of these developing countries. So that is a question we're trying to ask. And you might, of course, think, well, isn't the answer to this question kind of simple and straightforward? You would sort of think, if our society becomes more gender equal, that probably would imply that men and women also just become more similar in their preferences. But it turns out that the answer is not that simple. So let me give you one example of something that we already knew from before we did this study. If you look at Scandinavian countries, and you look at the gender gap, for example, in engineering, it turns out that gender gap tends to be bigger in Scandinavian countries than in, say, developing countries, and that's kind of known as a bit of a puzzle. Why is that actually happening? If the country is so gender equal, how come women and men seem even more different in engineering compared to other countries? But then if you look maybe at other preferences and other interests, you'll find the opposite. So at the end, there's a little bit of a puzzle here where we don't quite know whether more gender equal countries, where gender equality, we think of men and women having equal access both to opportunities and to resources to access those opportunities, right? So if we think of gender equality defined that way, does it make men and women more similar, or does it make them more different in their interests and in their preferences?
And can you explain the theory? Why would you think that one of these two things would happen? Like, why would you think that men and women would be more different in more equal countries?
Yes. So as is often the case, it turns out that there are kind of two competing theories here, right? So on the one hand, there is a social role theory. Social role theory kind of argues that most of the differences between men and women in their preferences and in their interests are a product of stereotypes, are a product of socialization, and are a product maybe of discrimination and all kinds of different social norms. And so according to that theory, when I make a country more gender equal in terms of opportunities and access to resources, I'm essentially removing some of these barriers I'm removing some of those stereotypes. I'm removing discrimination. And then you would expect men and women to become more similar. Mm-hmm. Right? That's one theory. The other theory that comes out of evolutionary psychology argues that when we remove barriers between men and women, when we make the society more gender equal, then women and men, both of them, can express truly who they are, right? So a man can express truly his interests as a man, and a woman can truly express her interests as a woman, and that may actually lead to increased differences between men and women, right? And so those are the two competing theories. One is looking at sort of interests and preferences that are product of stereotypes and socialization, and the other one is looking at interests and preferences that are a little bit more innate, right? This idea, what is my true self, my true innate self, who I really am as an individual and as a person, comes to greater expression and has a greater ease to express itself if I live in a completely free society, right? Where the individual can just express whomever he or she is.
But wouldn't you expect that these things would be correlated somehow? So if you live if men are more innate, prone to be to join the army, for example, and you also have this social role that would just enforce that innate preference.
Yes. So we can get back to the issue of how exactly do we want to define it. But you're already pointing to kind of one issue, which is how do we distinguish between interests that are potentially innate and interests that are more socially constructed. And so the example you give is a really interesting one. So there may be, and there are many cases where one can reinforce the other, right? Where, for example, maybe in the old times where physical force was important, to give the example of the army, right? So physical force was very important in the army. And so because of that, it was more sort of attractive, if you wish, for men than for women. And you could sort of think, fast forward a couple thousand years, and now we wage war as if we were playing computer games, right? Where physical force is maybe not as important anymore. So we say that initial difference between men and women doesn't exist anymore in the present world. But it could, of course, be that these gender patterns, which have a deep origin in, say, a physical strength, were then passed on through the generations, through socialization and through social norms to the present day, where maybe that physical force is no longer important, but the gender roles are still in place. And so is that innate? It's not truly innate, although the expression of those preferences may have some origin deep in the past that have to do with some innate differences between men and women.
Yeah, okay, I understand. So what makes your study special?
So one thing that makes us, I think, different or special compared to previous work is that in previous work, most studies have focused or focused on a few particular interests. So the example, for instance, of interest in math or interest in engineering or interest in the sciences. So a few interests, and that's what people studied. What's different here is that we are looking at a very broad set of interests. As you said in the title, we are actually looking at 45,000 different interests. And so to give you a little bit of background of how we constructed those interests and why this is interesting. So what we essentially did is we used Facebook's marketing API to get information on the share of male Facebook users and the share of female Facebook users that are interested in 45,000 different topics, right? And we do this for all countries of the world. So to give a concrete example, right, this procedure would tell us how many men and how many women in Denmark are interested in BMW, or how many men and how many women in Peru are interested in Jesus, right? So and 45,000 of these different interests. And so once we have all that information, we can actually compute measures of how different men and women are in these different countries, and then we can relate this to how gender equal these countries are. That's kind of the procedure we followed here.
So and you define some preferences that are gender related and some preferences that are non-gender related. Can you talk a little about how you define that?
Yes. So what we did is the following. So we have these 45,000 different interests in all these countries by gender, by men and women. And then we say the following. Let's suppose there are certain interests which we call gender-related interests, which are interests that exhibit the same gender bias pretty much in all countries of the world. So, example, right? No matter which country you look at, the Facebook data show you that men are more interested than women in cars, or they're more interested than women in football, and that's true no matter which country you choose in the world. And the same for women. It turns out that women are more interested, for example, in children than men all over the world. That doesn't mean men are not interested in children, right? It's not the intensity of preferences. It's a relative statement. It simply says that no matter which country I take of the world, women are always somewhat more interested in children than men. They're somewhat more interested in hair care than men, right? And so we call those interests gender-related interests, right? And then there's other interests. And those other interests, we call them non-gender related. And those are interests where in some countries, men are more interested. In other countries, women are more interested. So for instance, you'll find a lot of these kind of neutral type interests, such as traveling. Is that a male interest? Is it a female interest? It depends where you look. In some countries, you'll see more men interested in traveling. In other countries, you'll find more women interested in traveling. And so we'll say that's a type of interest that doesn't show a clear gender bias, and we call that a non-gender related interest, right? And so that's how we distinguish between these two types of interests.
And how do you handle interests that are just more or less equally split in all countries? For example, travel. Let's say that in some countries it's 51-49, and in other countries it's the opposite. So how do you handle that? Those interests that are very close to equal.
Yes. So that's a very good question. So you can choose different thresholds, right? You can say, I want the difference between men and women, for instance, to be big enough, or I want this randomness to also be big enough for me to classify it as gender related, as non-gender related. And so what you're essentially pointing at is there may also be a middle group, right, where it's not exactly obvious whether it's in one, whether we can classify it in one group or in the other. And actually, you're quite right. So when I say we split it up into these two groups, it's true that not all interests fit in one of the two groups. There's some interests that are neither one or the other. They're kind of in between, and it's a little harder to tell where exactly they fit.
Yeah, okay, I understand. So one thing I was thinking about was, is there a risk that you assume something here? That's, for instance, you say that it's innate, but I think maybe we touched a little on this before. But that you say that, okay, all men all men are more in most countries. Men are more interested in Lionel Messi, for example. But could it be cultural? Like, could it be some cultural thing that started in Africa and then followed the human race all around the globe? And how do you handle that?
Yes, that's a very good question. So let me try to maybe go in a few steps here. Let me first say what we do with this result, what we do with this distinction, and how we relate it to these two theories. And then I would like to maybe return to the question you asked, because the question you just asked is actually a very important one. But it's hard to exactly explain before I give you a little bit more background about what we do. If that's okay.
So let's find out who's the winner here.
Yeah. So you see once we've distinguished between gender-related and non-gender-related interests, we find something which we think is quite interesting, right? It is the fact that when we focus on the subgroup of gender-related interests, say soccer or cars or children or beauty products or whatever, when we only focus on these gender-related interests, we actually find that in more gender-equal countries, say in Scandinavia, the difference between men and women is bigger than in other countries, right? And that fits the theory of evolutionary psychology, whereas when we look at the non-gender-related interests, the traveling and there's also some stuff, for example, physical fitness, things like that. When we look at these non-gender-related interests, we actually find the opposite. We find that if I take a country in Scandinavia, for instance, that men and women, in terms of their interest or preference for traveling, for instance, would be more similar than men and women in other countries. And that fits more social role theory. And so you could, of course, say, how is it possible that there's these two competing theories? How can it be that you find evidence in favor of both? And how do I then declare a winner? Well, in some sense, there is no winner. And the reason why there's no winner, actually, at least in our view, is that these two theories really are talking about two different types of interests or preferences, right? So evolutionary psychology emphasizes innate preferences, whereas social role theory emphasizes socially constructed interests. Now, of course, you could say, okay, but what does that have to do with your distinction? Because you're not distinguishing between innate versus socially constructed. However, the way we look at it is we say, look, I can't give you any proof of saying this interest is innate and this interest is not innate. But the way we look at it is we say, look, if an interest is innate, then we would expect that interest to express itself between men and women in a similar way across the planet, right? So if you say that if there's an innate predilection in men for war, to give the example you were giving before, then we should see this in all countries of the world if it's truly innate, right? And so that's this distinction we make. We say these gender-related interests, the way we define them, are potentially innate. I don't know if they're innate, but they're potentially innate. right? And it turns out that if I take that definition, then our results actually exactly fit the theory versus these other interests that in some countries men prefer and other countries women prefer. That can't really be innate, because if it were innate, it should have the same gender expression everywhere. In those interests that are therefore potentially socially constructed, I find evidence in favor of social role theory, right? So that's kind of the distinction we try to make. And now to come back to your original question, which is, are you really sure, for example, that a particular interest, such as the interest in soccer or the interest in Messi, is that really an innate interest? The honest answer to that question is I don't know. The only thing I can tell you is that it is an interest that in its gender expression shows up identically across all countries of the world, across the globe. And that, as you very well said, is actually still consistent with two possible views, right? You could take the view of saying this could be maybe innate, right? But the emphasis is in potentially innate, because I don't really know. Why could it be innate? You could say, well, there might be some hormonal differences between men and women, such that men tend to like competition in whatever form more than women. Suppose you include in competition soccer games. That may explain why men like all kinds of sports and women are a little bit less interested in sports, right? So that could have some deep innate origin, especially when we see this across all countries of the world. But as you said, it could also be socially constructed. If you're willing to take the stand of saying, when something is socially constructed through maybe globalization and the diffusion of culture across the globe, there are, of course, examples of ideas and norms and cultural attitudes that originate in a particular place and take over the globe, right? And so we all end up being interested in something, but it really doesn't have an innate origin. It's just that, it started somewhere, and then through globalization, it kind of became globally socially constructed in the same way. And that, of course, we cannot discard, right? So in that sense, what we are saying is, look, we are finding some interesting results here, and they are consistent with these two theories, but we fall short in fully proving to you that, yes, these interests are innate, and these interests are socially constructed. We can't make that point, and neither would we want to make it, right? I mean, that would be overselling. That would be overselling what we're doing.
Yeah, but I still find your paper very what's called what is the English word for this? Convincing. Because I totally understand what you say, and when you have so many interests, it's difficult to kind of make a plausible theory to say that all these interests are actually social constructions when they're so far spread out. So I find it convincing. I think you have to explain to me one more time why is it that because we have equal societies in Scandinavia, why is it that we will see more male being engineers and more female being nurses, for example? What is this? Why does this equality leads to this outcome? I'm not sure I understood that first time you explained it.
I think, and of course, I'm trying to paraphrase evolutionary psychology here, but even if, suppose we go a little bit beyond this particular discussion on gender, and think of the broader question whether true equality whether that leads to more homogenization or more diversity. I think that's kind of an interesting and fascinating question, right? So you can sort of think, if everybody is completely free, maybe there's less pressure to homogenize, and I can be free to express myself, who I truly feel that I am. So maybe let's put it this way: if you go to a country that's less gender equal, there may be some expectations that that women also take on certain professions, even if they're not particularly interested in it, right? And so it could be that in the case of engineering, that if I'm truly free to choose, maybe I just don't like engineering that much, and I'd rather study medicine, right? Or by the way, I maybe rather study mathematics. So in fact, we don't. If you look at it globally, I don't know about Scandinavian countries per se, but if you look at it globally, this greater difference between men and women in engineering doesn't extend to all of the sciences, right? So it's not like all the STEM fields are more interesting to men and to women. We of course know that in medicine it may be the opposite. In biology, it's maybe the opposite, and even in mathematics, it's much more closer to 50-50 than say in engineering, right? And so some people have made the argument that and I wouldn't want to sound stereotypical here, but sort of the idea that and there's some evidence from psychology that men tend to be more interested in objects, and women tend to be more interested in people, right? And so, or in other humans, and so that could, for example, explain why women are more interested in medicine and men are more interested in engineering, versus, say, mathematics, which is mathematics not per se about building something, but it's not really about people either, and so that's math just doesn't show as strong a gender bias as, say, engineering or some other fields.
So I think if you had asked me 2 weeks ago, before I read your study, yes, whether gender equality would lead to the genders being more, having more of the same interests, I would probably say that I could probably see that more women would play men's sports, for example, just because they felt like they had to do it just to show that we have an equal society. So I could also see the argument for the other way around, that people would, I know this doesn't fit to your data, but to have any view on this, that if you live in a society that is very focused on men and women being equal in outcome, then you would see some women choosing to go into a male subject interest, and you'll also see some men go into to the female interest. For example, more men being nurses, just to show that we have an equal society. Can you see where I'm?
Yes, I can see what you're saying, and I'm very sorry. So one argument I've heard, but I don't really have evidence on right now, is whether there may be some kind of non-linearity here, right? Sort of, if there's more equality, maybe I also want to show that I'm more equal, and so men and women actually do become more similar in certain dimensions. But then when I'm kind of beyond that point, where I'm just truly free and I'm truly equal, then I may not have that need anymore to show that, for example, it's like showing my identity, right? So I could choose to show my identity as a male, but I could also I could choose to show my identity by saying, I want to show to you that I'm gender equal, and hence I'm going to, as part of my identity, do things that are traditionally more associated with women, and just to show that I'm an equality person.
Yes,
right?
Yes, exactly.
But I think maybe when a society has advanced enough, and we live in a truly equal society, those types of concerns that you raise may become less important.
Yeah.
Right? Because they kind of disappear from what we view as issues that are important to solve. Once the issue of equality of opportunity has truly been solved, right, then I wouldn't have the need anymore to express my identity in that particular way. And I could actually move beyond that and then, just truly express whomever I feel like being, so that I no longer feel that, okay, I'm maybe associating myself with certain preferences that are traditionally viewed as being very male, and someone else associates herself with some preferences that are traditionally viewed as very female. And we don't view that anymore as an issue, or we don't view that anymore as saying, well, that person is acting as if he's superior to the other one, or vice versa. It's just what I feel like doing, and this is how I express my identity. And if you choose to become an engineer and I choose to become a doctor, or you want to be a nurse and I want to be a school teacher, there's no reason why you should judge any one of us as being better or superior or having achieved something more. I'm just doing whatever I feel like doing. And that's of course a society we could all aspire to, right? Of saying it's just true freedom.
There's also the possibility, because I think you're right that one reason to do that, like start playing rugby as a female, just to show that you want equality, is kind of to show who you are. But maybe there's just not that many people who wants to do something. I mean, who's political enough to want to do something they don't really want, just to show that they are political. So, I mean, probably most people just want to live a good life and do what they find interesting. So that might be why.
I think that's probably true. I think, there may be some people like that, but it's probably a small minority.
Yeah, so you won't find it in your numbers. So I guess so. Where does this leave us in terms of these preferences being innate versus socially constructed? Would you say that some preferences are innate and others are social constructions?
I think that's right. I think some preferences are innate. There's evidence from experiments. There's evidence from the psychology literature. So for instance, we know that there are differences between males and females in terms of, for example, risk aversion, right? In terms of love for competition, and in terms of certain other character traits. So there are some differences, and these differences may express themselves in different choices we make. For example, different interests that we might have in the choices we make, etc. So definitely there are some interests that are innate. There are many other interests that are socially constructed, and there's many that we don't really know to what extent they are innate and to what extent they are socially constructed. So I don't think that is a debate that's easily solvable. It's a bit the same as the whole debate in education and genetics on nature versus nurture, right? To what extent do your genes matter versus your environment? And we know that the answer is always both. But then, of course, you will want to know to what extent is one more important than the other. And it's a bit of an endless debate. I think we can safely say that both forces exist, and that they also have a complex. There's a complex interrelation as well. You know, as before, there may be the social construction may not be completely independent of certain innate differences.
Sure.
And the other interesting observation is, for example, that certain innate differences that may have to do with our biology may, of course, also disappear because of, let's say, technological change. Right. So, for example, if you say, the example we gave before, if certain professions were not accessible to women because of physical force, if physical force is no longer important because machines can do it, well, then that difference disappears, right? And so on and so forth. So even the innate part is not necessarily persistent and permanent, because we can also kind of fix our biology, right? You may have, and the same is of course true when we talk about two individuals. It doesn't have to be a man versus a woman, right? You may have a certain edge compared to me in language skills or in translation, but then maybe I can partly compensate that now because I have Google Translate.
Yeah.
Right? So some of these differences between individuals or between groups may also just become less important because we have ways to overcome them.
So
right?
So one thing I was thinking about, because I mean, at least in Denmark, I think in many countries around the world, this is an important political question. And I think most people think that if it's an innate difference, then it's not a problem. But if it's a socially constructed difference, then it's a problem. You can probably have different views on that, but I think that many people would say that. So one question is how do we know, if we look at a part of the labor market where there's a big gender difference, how can we tell if it's innate or not? Like, is there some common rules we can use?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting question, and before answering, yes, of course, I of course to some extent agree with you, right? So if we think that differences in preferences are mostly socially constructed, then you can imagine that removing these barriers could greatly improve our economic well-being, right? Mm-hmm. And so if for instance if we keep, as traditionally was done, if we keep women out of certain professions, say the medical profession, right, say 50 years ago or 100 years ago, that may have had huge costs, right, in terms of the misallocation of talent.
Yes.
And there's actually quite a bit of research that has been done on that, and that has shown that indeed, the incorporation of women into the labor force and into many of these professions, such as the medical and the legal.
Yeah, so basically what you say is that there could be a lot of great female doctors, but they just never got to help patients.
That's right. And so we were not really allowing, I guess the view there is that the view of an economist, right, would be to say, okay, let me take all these people here. I take all the people in Denmark and let everybody, according to his or her comparative advantage, choose a profession that best expresses whatever that person is good at, right? And that will give me the best and most efficient allocation of talent. And when I do this, I don't want to see the color of your skin. I don't want to see your gender. I don't want to see anything, right? I want everybody to actually dedicate themselves to whatever they're better at, right? And so, as I said, there's been some papers that have shown that the incorporation of women into medical, legal profession, etc., has greatly contributed to increased efficiency and productivity gains, right? And so, if in that case you would say, well, any policies that reduce barriers and create more equality in terms of men and women in terms of these different professions would be a good thing. Versus when you say, well, I'm not so sure, because if it's truly the expression of their preferences that women don't find computer science as interesting as men, and maybe men nowadays don't find the medical profession as attractive as women. If that is really just their preferences, then it's a little bit less clear whether policy should intervene beyond, of course, creating equal opportunity and equal access to that opportunity. You would still want that, right? I mean, you would say, well, I want a level playing field, and then I want to let everybody choose. And so you could then say, how can I know whether one is the case or the other is the case, and how can I really sort of know what's going on? One way, of course, would be to say, if I get a society that's truly equal in terms of opportunities and access, and I realize that in some professions, women, for example, make great inroads, and to repeat myself, in the medical profession has been a complete transformation, right, in many countries of the world, versus maybe in a few professions where that is not happening. For example, in computer science, that has happened to a much smaller extent. That may give you some indication. Of course, even then, we can never be 100% sure that it's not socially constructed, right? Just because, the whole interplay, it may just mean that in medicine, the barriers were a little bit lower, and in computer science, the barriers are a little bit higher. But it might also be that, yes, that in a truly equal society, women will make different choices than men, and men will make different choices than women, and we should be fine with that. So that the ideal of 50-50 and everything, and now we're talking about professions, but it could be about anything else, right? It could be you're interested in cooking, or you're interested in running, or you're interested in spirituality, whatever it is, right? Do we think that the ideal world would be one of 50-50, for example? And so, you go to church, and if everybody who's in that church is there truly because they want to be there, would I expect that church to be 50% male, 50% female, for example, right? I don't know. So those are the types of questions that I think are fascinating, whether we think that the 50-50 always and everywhere is the ideal point we're trying to reach.
Yeah, and I think that there's another difficult question, because if there's some regulation that makes it difficult for female, for example, to be doctors, then it's at least fairly relatively easily to remove that regulation. Just say, okay, from now on, females can be doctors. But if it's social norms, then it's less obvious how you fix that barrier, because I mean it's very. First, can I say something first? Because first of all, if a person is brought up in a family where the wife is at home and raises the kids and don't go to work, and they adopt these preferences and think that's the best way to live, then it's still real preferences. So it's difficult just to say that now you can't do that. Now you have to join the labor force, because that's not the preference, because it was socially formed in the childhood. Yes. So I think regulation is a lot easier, because you just have to remove regulatory barriers. But when we talk about social norms, it's, at least to me, it's not obvious how to fix this. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah. So I agree. So we were just saying, if it's socially constructed, maybe we should intervene. When it's through preferences, maybe there's less reason to intervene. But what you're saying is, well, even if it's socially constructed and there's social norms, it's not obvious you want to intervene, because, if that is my true preference, then who am I to say, for example, as a state, that it's better not to have those preferences? Why should I kind of try to tweak people's preference, and why would I want to change social norms? I think that's a respectable point of view. Right? You could just say, well, then that's what it is. This is the true preferences. One potential reason why you may want to intervene is when you think that there's a bit of an intertemporal kind of inconsistency here, where you say, if I were to be able to move the needle on those social norms, I will eventually get to a society where people and individuals are more free, where they'll be able to do what they want. And I view that as sort of a superior outcome versus a society where, people are trapped in certain social norms, which are there because of historical persistence. Of course, you're making a value judgment here, right? You're sort of starting to say, these social norms I like, and these other social norms I don't like. And so I agree, for a state, it's not that easy to kind of take that position. As you say, it's sort of removing certain regulatory barriers is kind of the easiest thing to do, and I think that's what most countries. Sort of advanced democracies, those are the types of steps they have taken. Of course, you can go a little bit beyond that. You can say sometimes removing barriers may not be enough. Why not? Well, because say I take the profession of finance, right? And we know that there's less female presence in finance than male. You could say, that's just a preference issue, because if a woman wants to go into finance, she can go into finance. And in fact, there's many, many examples of successful women in finance, but they're still underrepresented. You say, okay, that's just preferences. Well, we're not sure, right? Because if more women would be in finance, then finance would be done in a slightly different way. And that would make it actually more attractive for other women to be in finance, right? So maybe it's not about finance per se. It's about the fact that finance is so male dominated, and the males, maybe the stereotype, right, of finance.
So for instance, what you say that
aggressive and competitive,
exactly,
and that's not attractive to females. It's not finance per se. Maybe they would be wonderful at doing finance, and again, there's maybe a misallocation of talent here, because they're not more present in that field, but they don't really want to get into the field because of the character of the field, not really about the work itself, but the character and the other people who are there.
But wouldn't you expect that that there'll be companies that, let's say, for instance, that finance is very competitive, and that's how you motivate the workers to perform, is by having competitions. And women don't like that, so they stay out of finance. But wouldn't you expect that if you have competition, there will arise companies that will say, okay, we motivate people in another way. So we attract the skilled female, and because there's a large talent pool where we can hire from.
Exactly. I think to the extent that companies realize that they are leaving money on the table, right? Because
exactly.
they're not attracting the best talent, and they have to do certain things to fix this. And so, yes, you would then say, well, I would probably gradually expect some change, especially in sectors where the labor market, for example, is very tight. And so maybe some of this is, of course, going on, but to which extent, I don't know.
Yeah, I think the main problem is to change social norms. First of all, because you're never sure if it is innate or social norm, and second of all, because there's not really a handle that is really great at, like, there's no policy that is really great at doing this, and you risk, like, if you want to change the social norm, how do you know that the new norm is better than the old norm? So I think my personal preference is that we just that we talk about it like we have done here, and as many people do, like, talk about, is it right that there's so few women in engineering? Is that because maybe just discussing it will make some women become interested in engineering, and we can solve the norms basically through discussing. Of course, it will take some time. But the good thing is that we don't have the same risk of making big mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I mean, we're always, of course, economists. We understand that social norms are very important in the way societies function and operate. But our understanding of how they form and how they evolve is still relatively poor, I would say, let alone sort of thinking about, with a few exceptions maybe, but thinking about ways for policies or for policy to intervene sort of drastically in changing social norms. I think the overall society we live in and the democracies we live in, of course, there is social change. And if you think about the last 50 years, there's been tremendous social change and social progress in many, many dimensions. And that is bound to continue. But then, of course, it does remain puzzling, right? Of saying, again, maybe if I would go to the 1940s and I would compare the medical profession, the legal profession, and the engineering profession, maybe those three professions looked relatively similar in terms of their male-female share and the fact that they were mostly male-dominated. And then over the next 50 years, in 2 out of the 3, there's been a huge transformation. But in 1 of the 3, there has been some change, but it has been much less. And I think it's those types of questions that we were interested in when we started this project. And those are the types of questions that we should learn more about, right? Before and the more we understand and the more we know, the better it will inform our policy decisions, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Klaus, it has been a pleasure to talk to you. Very interesting. So thank you so much for participating in Regelstaten.
Okay. Thank you, Jonas. It was very nice to talk with you.
Og til jer, der sidder og lytter med derude, så kan I som altid kontakte mig på herby@cepos.dk eller via sociale medier. Jeg burde være til at fange stort set overalt. Hvis I har gode emner til folk, jeg skal tale med, eller bare emner, jeg skal tage op, så er I meget, meget velkommen til at foreslå det til mig. Tak for i dag.